And this evening, what we wanted to do primarily is share the information that we've gathered thus far, talk a little bit about the process with the Department of Education for a project like this, let you know where we stand in decision making, where we are in the process. We're really at the very beginning phases, and get some feedback from you as well. So if Roberta could introduce the project to you a little bit, that would get you up to speed on where we are and what's happened in the past to get us here.
Thank you, Kathy and Alan. This is a quick follow-up. I just spent the better part of an hour plus working through the virtual forum. So this is our seventh public forum event that we began the process in January. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm Roberta Herson, the Superintendent of Schools here in MSAD 49. And as far as the history goes, how we've arrived at where we are today in the process, I would say it began with the Facilities Committee building study, and that was started in the fall of 2012. And at some point shortly after, the building committee engaged Oak Point Associates, who is an architectural and engineering firm, to do a structural study of our elementary schools. And those include Fairfield Primary, Albion Elementary, and Clinton Elementary, as identified as the Facilities Committee as needing some work for improvement. Benton Elementary was not part of that study because it was a newer facility with a renovation completed in the very late 80s, I think in 88. The school district submitted 3 school project applications to the Maine Department of Education in March of 2017 for major capital improvement. And a little bit of information, so that's when the state opened up their rating cycle, and it had been a full 8 years prior to that since it had been open again. So there's, I would say, a very predictable pattern. It's not like every 5 years or every 10 years that this opportunity comes to us. But that was the last time it was opened up. In the spring of 2018, the Department of Education published a final priority rank order list of the 75 applications it received from school units. So there were 74 schools, and this district had submitted 3 applications, and that's somewhat common as far as school units go, and looking at a more broad issue of maintaining aging facilities. Fairfield Primary, once the rank order came out, landed number 1 on that list of 74, Clinton Elementary number 39, and Albion Elementary at 58. In December of 2018, this district hosted a Maine State Board of Education meeting in Fairfield Primary School. So that was December, after that list had come out earlier. And I think that's customary for the schools listed top on the list to host the Board of Education meetings. October 8th, 2019, I received a call from Commissioner Macon notifying me and the other 2 schools on the 1, 2, 3 selected that she was recommending to the Board of Education that they approve construction projects for those 3. And the board met the next day at Rumford Elementary and made that announcement. So in the intervening year plus, I have met along with some school board members and our architects since about the process. So we've met with Scott Brown, who is the Director of School Facilities Major Capital Construction Program of the DOE, and he has a team associated with them. And they've been very helpful to us and for our community to understand that the Department of Education has a hand in the process with some criteria, and part of the decisions that will come out of this are based on what the DOE requires of us as we move forward for a project they will agree to fund that is yet to be determined. One of the initial steps was for the school district to select an architect, a firm, to conduct a feasibility study. and we had a selection committee comprised of board members and myself and Scott Washburn. And we interviewed several firms. I think we interviewed maybe 4 or 5. And the team, the committee selected CHA. And in March of 2020, the district hired the firm to conduct this study. And in December of 2020, CHA, having completed their study, presented their findings to the school board in this gymnasium. And shortly thereafter, the school board formed the building committee. And our initial work has been to consider ways to engage the communities as part of our school district. And as I said, this is our 7th forum. And we've refined it a little bit. We initially planned for 2 and had some conversations with the department, and all of us felt like we needed more involvement. It's very difficult, and the challenge of distancing people's comfort in coming out in public events. I mean, that's unfortunate because, as you'll hear from the firm and from us, is that involvement from our community is vital to the process, and people being satisfied and supportive and feeling good about, the direction we're moving in here. So Kathy and Alan are going to share with you some more of the work that they've done, and they'll review some findings from their study. And it's an opportunity to hear from our community, to ask some questions. And we have some other pieces set up on our website where you're able to do that virtually. But it is a long process out to when, the door opens and children pass through the doorway of that new building years away. And there's a lot of work to do. So we are at the very infancy of it, but it's exciting. And just from my view and understanding that it is a gift, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We say this again and again, but I've been here 22 plus years working in this district. We have never been in the queue as far as the department's list for projects. As I said, Benton was the most recent school, and that was a renovation. The Williamson went up, but that was not state-sponsored. It was local. We had a benefactor. And I just am hopeful that we can take the good and the opportunity here and, marshal the feelings and will of our school communities to serve our children as best as we possibly can. And as we move through this, and understanding that the education we provide is bigger and more than a facility, but it's all the potential for the programming that happens in those walls, and for the people who work there and work with our children, and for the children's experience themselves. And one of the other things that we'll consider as we head down this path is what school districts are charged with as far as programming. And that has changed quite dramatically and evolved, over the years since any of these buildings went up. So there's a lot to consider, but again, it's a wonderful opportunity. It's a gift laid in our lap, and we need to be judicious about it and careful, but capitalize on it as best we can. So thank you for being here, Kathy and Alan. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Roberta. So, as I mentioned before, we have some goals for tonight. We want to make sure that we share with you what we've learned so far about your existing buildings, talk about some of the concerns and issues that you as the community have had, what we've heard already in our previous forums. Also, we want to hear from you what your concerns are. I want to talk to you a little bit about what the process looks like for the entirety of the project, and then get some more feedback from you as well. So, as Roberta mentioned, the first thing that the Department of Education asked us to do is really kind of dive into your existing buildings and understand what you have for existing facilities. And we look at a number of things when we do that. It's the physicality of the buildings. We look at the existing capacity in the buildings, how those buildings are currently used. We look at what the systems are, what the status of the systems are, so the electrical system, mechanical system, sprinkler, life safety systems. We look at the we look at the site capacity. Is the site large enough to actually add on to these buildings? And what does the site look like? Does it allow for safe site circulation? Is there sufficient parking? Is there enough play area, etc.? So the first building that we looked at was Fairfield. Fairfield was originally built in 1907. It was rebuilt after the fire in 1927, and then the annex was added, which was in 1952. It is partially sprinkled, so it does have a partial sprinkler system. It has a lot of barrier-free non-compliance, so that means that there's accessibility issues in the building, significant accessibility issues. One of the most concerning things about this building is that although it's a very small footprint, it has 13 different levels inside the building, which is a lot. That's a lot of stairs up and down. And it's especially problematic for pre-K, K students in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a fabulous school. Actually, the original building looked much different than what you're seeing here because it was rebuilt after the fire. It actually had a pitched roof and a lot of detail. It was really beautiful. But now to be used for early childhood education, pre-K, K, early child care, on all these different levels with open stairwells that wouldn't be permitted. We see this as this and the aging systems. I think when you look at the school and you walk around, you can see remnants of the old systems, the old boiler that was left in place, or wiring that's been worked around. These systems are at the end of their useful life.
The other thing that's challenging about this building is it's only on a 1.4 acre lot. So the site is completely maximized with the playground and the little bit of parking, and there's no site circulation on site for parents to control. It all happens on the street. So that's not ideal. We typically don't like to see that especially for small age kids. So then we looked at Albion. Oops, there we go. And the Albion School, the original building was built in 1952 with an addition put on in 1980. It is also a relatively small site at about 5.9 acres. It does not have a lot of expansion opportunity, combined pickup and drop off for the bus and the parents, which is congested at the busiest times of the day, so that's challenging. It also has some accessibility concerns, multiple steps up, steps down to get in and out of different spaces. The wood batten siding on the exterior of the building is not in great condition. And it does not have a sprinkler system, and the electrical and mechanical systems are kind of patchwork together. They're quite outdated. We would say that the mechanical, electrical systems are at the end of their lifespan. If we were to add on to this building, a full sprinkler system would be required by code.
The other thing about Albion and Fairfield, there's no ventilation system to speak of,
Right.
other than the windows. What is there for Albion has been plugged up, and so it was hard to determine whether there was any mechanical ventilation happening.
So here you see the blue area was the addition onto the pink area. Pink was built in 1952, and then the addition was put on in 1979. The Benton Elementary School is your newer building. That one, it was originally built in the 1950s, but there was an addition put on in 1989. And with that addition came a substantial renovation of that existing building. And so during that renovation, asbestos was removed from the existing building, and the renovation is quite good. And given that it's the newer building, it does have mechanical ventilation. The systems are a little bit newer and do have some life left in them. Site circulation is a little bit of a challenge here. It is also a small site. So just for reference, when the Department of Education builds a brand new building, they are looking for 20 acres plus 100 acres for each one, or 1 acre, for each 100 students. So if you're looking at a 400 student school, the Department of Education would be asking the district to look for that whole site circulation thing that I keep harping on, the separation of bus drop-off from parent drop-off to keep congestion at a minimum, keep safety as a priority. And then also with current Department of Environmental Protection requirements, there's requirements for stormwater treatment and runoff treatment, et cetera. So that explains why the sites are quite large, but it also explains why these sites are considered quite small. And because they are on the small side, it's difficult to propose additions to these buildings because the sites are already primarily maximized by the building and the circulation that's there already, playgrounds, et cetera. So one of the things that's really, although Benton does have some accessibility concerns in the building, one of the things that's really nice about this building is the layout is really great for an elementary age group. It has it has a central organizing, the organizing feature for these little houses here. So these are kind of classroom pods, houses we call them. So these classrooms are all sort of centered around an shared activity space. And then each of those pods are centered around a double height learning pad or library, which is great. It's a lovely organization to a smaller building, or to a larger building rather. It creates these sort of smaller communities of classrooms, and then it also has the original building, which is this blue here, is where the gymnasium is. So that's sort of where the public might come to the building after hours, and it has its own entry there too, which is a nice way to keep those two spaces, those two primary uses separate.
But I was going to say, with all these schools, ADA came along in 2009, and I've been saying this to everyone, they all have the similar issues related to ADA. That lever handle lock set, having enough room on the push-pull side of the doors, ramps, steps in the bathrooms, grab bars, and the list goes on. And that all came along in 2009. So all these buildings are pretty much what we have experienced in the rest of our school design. Even on Benton here, the sinks and bathrooms don't require this ADA.
One of the challenges at Benton is that these classrooms are on the small side. They're each only about 600 square feet. And a typical new classroom with Department of Education standards is about 800 square feet for grades 1 through 6, and then it's actually bigger for pre-K. Science classrooms are also a little bit bigger. So the challenge there, of course, is that at Benton, that's where you have, in your district, you have your highest student-teacher ratio. You're averaging about 20 to 20 students in those classrooms. That's a lot to ask of a 600 square foot space. It's a lot to ask of your sixth graders, too, in those spaces, right? So those are a bit small, which is challenging. And then the other thing that's a little challenging about this building is that each of those pods have pitched roofs on them, so it makes it a little bit difficult to add on to them. Just sort of functionally adding on to those buildings is challenging.
But I think what you were saying, though, the attributes that make Benton a school is the fact that it's a larger school, but the house concept really sort of starts to break down the mass and the scale to make it a smaller building and making it more accessible. And having the library of learning commons is the centerpiece, really sort of aggregates the circulation for wayfinding, and that's really nice. I think there are improvements that could happen with the arrival zone and having a control point in the administrative office that's right next to the entry vestibule will be helpful, and having clear, separated bus drop-off and parent drop-off queuing areas.
Then we looked at Clinton, and Clinton has a lot of the same type of concerns that we saw at Albion and Fairfield with accessibility. At Clinton, you see plumbing was added into the building, and so you have to step up into the bathrooms in order to get into those. So that's an accessibility concern. The other thing that's happened at Clinton is there were multiple additions put on that building. So the original building was built in 1940. There were additions made in 1949, 1959, 1963, 1974. So there's lots of additions added, which means that the mechanical system was sort of patchworked on together as well. And although, it's been very well maintained, it still air ventilation and heating that are not addressed by a system-wide approach. We also see some work around for additional technology and electrical added to the building after the fact. And plumbing fixtures at the end of their list as well. This one, the site circulation is challenging here. Again, it's only about 5 acres, and parking is right at the front of the building, it's right adjacent to the street. Drop off and pick up, again, congested at this building as well. Here you see the original building. It was this 2-story building here in blue, and then the 1949 edition in orange, 59 in light pink, 63 in purple, 74 in dark pink, and then the 1989 edition, the little classroom edition up there. This is the primary entry. Again, the parking is right up against the building and right adjacent to the street as well. So it's just very compact and tight, and not an ideal situation in terms of what we call natural surveillance of the site. So the idea that there is an understanding of what's happening on the site from within the building, because you can see more of the approach to the building, right? So there's some natural surveillance of who's coming to the building.
And the other thing is with the original 1940s building, with the stairs, the music building is down underneath. So there's no elevator access. It's not accessible to that part of the program. The other thing that happens with, especially with Clinton and Avignon, is when there are changes in program, kindergarten goes over here, or we need another first grade classroom, the bathrooms aren't always in the most appropriate places, right? The bathroom might be with the first grade or the third grade, but it's now not over here with the kindergarten or pre-K. So, not pre-K, kindergarten. That's what happens with buildings like this. The other thing is there's been so many workarounds, and we'll talk about the energy costs and the operational costs, that to go to do something, you have to go through a whole bunch of layers. It's wood frame, it's rated, you can't get to the plumbing, so it makes it very difficult to really keep up with changes, whether it's educational or the physicality of the building.
So I alluded to the next thing that we looked at, which was the energy usage of the buildings. And when we look at buildings like this, we know that there are multiple fuel sources for these different buildings. So we use a metric that's called energy use intensity, where we basically take all of the fuel sources for a building and sort of convert it down to kBTU per square foot, and that's called energy use intensity. And that allows us to compare a more apples to apples across the board of the buildings. So when we did that, we gathered, Scott Washburn gave us all of this data that we then computed into these factors. And basically what we're looking at for Albion is an energy use intensity of 99, 89 for Benton, 66 for Clinton. And for reference, a current code meeting building, the energy intensity, we would expect the EUI to be closer to 30 to 35. We're doing new buildings that are right around 35 right now. So this is not unexpectedly high for the age of the buildings, but what's important to remember is that these buildings, with the exception of Benton, don't include ventilation, so there's no mechanical ventilation in these buildings, which we encountered as a challenge when the district got CARES money to upgrade and improve ventilation in the existing buildings to address concerns about air quality. Benton could be modified and upgraded, but the other 3 buildings didn't have a ventilation system to address at all. So when we look at, and Alice talked about this before, but when we look at new buildings, ventilation is about 30% of the energy consumption of a new building. So if you were to add another 30% onto these existing buildings, you'd see that those EUIs are quite high. Comparatively, for a new building about the same size as Benton, with ventilation, with a comprehensive mechanical electrical system, we're looking at an EUI closer to 35. So that's a significant difference in terms of energy usage. And that plays out in the cost as well, right? So the annual cost per square foot $1 and $1.72 for those schools, whereas a new building would be closer to around 60 cents a square foot. Then we also looked at operational costs, also data that we got from Scott from the 2018-2019 years. And Albion is running at about $3.73 a square foot for operational costs. Benton $1.87, Clinton $2.44, Fairfield $1.90. And a typical new construction building, just for benchmarking purposes, would be we're seeing about $1 a square foot for operations. And there are a number of reasons that is lower. Part of it is things like the type of flooring that you put in requires less. New flooring doesn't require stripping and waxing every year. And just the fact that it's a newer maintenance system, new mechanical systems requires less maintenance. Other finishes don't require as much maintenance that those new buildings do, or as existing buildings do. But the point is that, for a new building, your operational costs and utility costs combined at $1.60 would be about 136,000 square feet, or $136,000 for an 85,000 square foot building, whereas Benton right now is about $285,000 annual operation and energy costs. So you can see how, just for benchmarking purposes, you can see what you're looking at, what you are currently spending in these buildings, what the cost of ownership looks like just to maintain and run these buildings. The other thing that we looked at was, given the fact that the existing mechanical, electrical, and life safety systems are at their end of their lifespan, we anticipate that in the next 10 years, you're going to potentially see some pretty significant costs associated with those, replacing major components of your systems and addressing these aging facilities. So we had our cost estimator run costs for just replacing electrical, mechanical, and sprinkler systems at these buildings at Albion and Clinton. Fairfield, in large part because Fairfield has so many levels in it, we don't recommend it for continued educational use. It's just not feasible to have that building be used for education given the number of levels and the age of the existing building. But for Albion and Clinton, we're estimating that in the next 10 or so years, we're going to see costs ranging from $3 to $4 million to upgrade electrical and mechanical systems and add a sprinkler system, and for Albion it would be a little bit higher. So we consider those anticipated costs of ownership that we expect those buildings to incur over the next 10 or so years.
Yeah, those will be essential repairs, but really doesn't get into energy conservation, added insulation, envelope, windows, roofing, all the other goodies. You're just going to be applying those costs to the envelope in the school that you have.
It also doesn't include any ADA upgrades.
Yeah.
So the buildings, these numbers don't include any changes to the accessibility features of the existing buildings. So then the other thing that the Department of Education wants the district to look at is what the projected enrollment is going to be for the district. So the district hired a third party to look at a substantial amount of data, including things like in-migration trends, out-migration trends, tuition students, birth rates, historic birth rates, current births, projected births, etc., to look at what the enrollment is going to be in this district in 10 years. And specifically for the pre-K age group, it looks like there's going to be a potential decline of about 100 students in that 10-year projection. So given the information that we have learned about your existing buildings, when we reported this out to the school board, it was our recommendation that Fairfield not be continued to be used for educational purposes, and that Clinton and Albion not continue to be used for educational purposes without those significant essential repairs being made. When we made that recommendation, we also went to the Department of Education to talk to them about that recommendation, and they have confirmed that those kinds of essential repairs are not something that they would support with state funding through this project. So those would be a local cost to upgrade those systems in those existing buildings for continued life of those two buildings.
There is the possibility, of course, of a state revolving renovation fund sometime in the future, when they make that available, and it's classified in different tiers. Typically the life safety things are at the top of the list, ADA improvements, asbestos removal. But when it's like the funding list, it's really depends on the economy and what's happening when those funds will be available, so we don't really know what it is.
So I was going to pause here for a second to see if there are any questions on the information we presented so far before I move on to the next stuff. Anything yet? Okay, I'll just keep going. There'll be other opportunities for comment and questions. Hold on to them. So as Roberta mentioned, we are doing a number of community forums. I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not it. This is not the end. There'll be lots more coming. There'll be opportunities for feedback in a meeting forum like this, but there's also ongoing opportunities through the survey on the website, and there's an email address for questions on the project as well. I'll show you how to access that information at the end. Some of the feedback that we've already received from the community forums include things about, what people have said they really like about their existing buildings, what they like about the community, what they're looking forward to with this opportunity. So, we like our neighborhood schools. The sense of community is really important. We hear that over and over again. Concerns about educational equity across the schools. Concerns about collegiality at the smaller schools. There may only be one or two first graders. That sense of collegiality that that you do have at Benton, where there are multiple grade teachers, is lost at some of the smaller schools, so there are concerns about that. But the pride between the staff and the students and the kids is an extremely valuable asset. At Benton, the small classrooms at Benton has come up a couple of times. And then in the survey, we're asking things like, what do you find exciting about this project and the potential for a project? And we're getting feedback like the chance to start fresh, an opportunity to reimagine the way education is delivered in the district, which I think is really exciting as well. What's most important to you, safety, health of the children and the staff, creating an energy efficient building, making sure that it's a clean, state-of-the-art building. But also there are things, but there are also things like what you like, what's most cherished about your schools now. Sense of community comes up over and over again, right? Small size, sense of community. Everybody knows their names, the names of the kids, the names of the parents. Fears about the project, will that it potentially just get railroaded through? We don't think that'll happen. The state doesn't really allow that to happen. They have a very strategic process that we have to follow. But that's a valid concern, and we want to make sure that there's plenty of opportunity for participation in order to address that. There are a couple of other interesting ones, fears about the project that the school won't have a big focus on nature and natural surroundings. We don't think outside the box to build a school building that's ideal for our children. Selling the concept to the community is a concern. So that's all really great feedback. And the thing that's really important about this feedback is that it gets baked into one of the next steps that's really important for the process, and that's what's called the educational specifications. And that's what the Department of Education asks the district to do, to think about what the educational vision is for the district. So what is important to the community? What's important to the school board? What are things that the district would like to offer that they can't offer now because of their existing facilities? What are things that they are able to offer at one school that they'd like to be offered at all of their schools, to all of their children? Those kinds of things will be documented and explored by a committee that the school board will project going forward. They shape everything from what is the project, to where is the project, to the finishes on the project at the very end. And so that document is something that is, it represents a collective effort to solicit information and feedback from the communities, but also the staff, the school board, and the students as well. So, issues that shape the project, things like potentially being able to offer universal pre-K, educational equity, we talked about that a little bit, and community feedback. Those are all things, and when I say community feedback, I think it's important to recognize that the staff play a big part in that, and the students as well. We typically interview, for these projects, we interview all of the staff, and we also interview students. And sometimes it's interview students, and sometimes it's, we send home a survey with their parents or give them a survey to actually fill out. And we get really interesting feedback from the younger kids. When we did that in Caribou, the kids asked for things like bathtubs in the school and showers and things like that. And when I did it at our high school, they wanted a swimming pool and they wanted, but it's still really important to get that feedback. It's important to know what's important to that community. The bathtub thing, we all kind of giggle, but it's because some of them didn't have bathtubs at home. So that was an important thing to consider when we were actually designing the building.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of things that have come into play with education. Since the last time you had an opportunity to build a new school, new spaces that have come along related to special education. That's been a tremendous area that's expanded in school programming. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of is maker spaces, innovation spaces, the new age of hands-on learning, robotics. So those are all exciting things, and a lot of our communities that we work with already have these programs in place. So it's a matter of really communicating that in the educational division and with the Department of Education. What makes your community and your school special that you want to bring forward, okay? So it's going to be an ongoing...
Another thing that we see in the ed spec sometimes are the desire to have a clinic at the school, so the potential for a state-funded clinic, so that students and families can have access to healthcare and dentist care, oral care, yes, right at the school, so that there isn't if they've got 2 or 3 kids in the school district, they can kind of all go see the health clinic for their annual physicals. There's potentially a nurse practitioner on site. There's maybe once a month, there's a dentist that comes to the school, so that you can offer more. The schools have become, it's more, right? It just becomes, it's more and more for the community. And that's another way that we're seeing school districts support their families through the schools. So to talk a little bit about the process, so this is the State Department of Education has a process that they have been using for decades that is a tried and true, well-worn path. It works for all of their projects. All of their state-funded projects follow the same process. They consider the process a 21-step process. Step 20 is when construction begins. So there's a long way to go before construction begins. And I think what's important to know about this graphic, it's impossible to read, but the important thing to know is that each of these little boxes represent different stakeholders that they expect to participate in each step along the way. So each of these numbered slots is one of the discrete steps that they want the project to take, and each of these boxes represent the stakeholders that need to participate in that. And those stakeholders range from staff to community to, like I said, the main DEP, the local fire department, the local police department, business community members, but also the Department of Education and the State Board of Education. Each of these orange slots here is where we go back to the State Board of Education for approval on that slice of the process. So those things include site selection, concept approval, and then funding approval. So I think one of the things that's important to understand about how the funding process works for these projects is that the Department of Ed has not said, you have $20 million to spend on this project, don't go over. What they do instead is they say, what is the project? What does the community want? What does the school board want? What is the project? And then we develop the project, we develop the program for the project with the district, we design the building, we figure out where it's going to be, and then we do multiple rounds of cost estimating to understand what the cost associated is with that project. We work with the Department of Education to agree on a cost, and then the cost comes after the project is developed, and that's what the State Board of Education supports. So it's not that they have dictated how much the project can be, how much you can spend, how much the district can spend. It's more of a process to arrive collectively at a budget for the project. And then once that's voted on at referendum, which is step 13, that's the project. It doesn't get added to after that point. That's the budget that gets approved. It's approved by the state, it's approved by the voters. That's what gets designed and built. And the biggest reason for that is that, and this comes into play kind of later on, but it's important to understand that when you're voting at referendum to approve the project, you're also voting to approve the ownership of the project and the costs associated with owning that project. So when we get to that point of referendum, you will have data the voters will have data that will tell them not only how much the project costs, but also what the operation and maintenance costs are for that project, for that, whatever that budget is. Because that's what the voters are taking on. Right? And that's why we don't make any changes to it, because we're not going to add a swimming pool after the fact, because that's a different set of ownership, cost of ownership issues, right?
Yeah, and I was going to say, one of the questions that we get asked was, what do these projects include? And, the Department of Education establishes I think a pretty good benchmark in terms of evenness amongst the state with all the facilities. And so they look at square footage per student, what the age group is, and what's included in the program. But at the end of the day, projects include everything. They include the cost of the property, they include fees, they include approvals, they include new furnishings, they include the finishes. So it's a complete project. It's a complete project.
So that talks a little bit about what is the project. And one of the things that the board is working through right now is what is the scope of the project. Although the Fairfield primary kindergarten building was the one that the state has said they will fund, when the state comes into a district and knows that there are other buildings on the list that were submitted for application for funding, and they want us to comprehensively look at all of the facilities and all of the opportunities and make sure that the district is addressing as much as feasible at one time, because they know that they might not be back to the district for a while. So they encourage the districts to, as we've been doing, really sort of holistically look at all of the facilities, especially the other two applications that went in, and see what can be done. So we don't know what the project is yet. We don't know if it's a single project that replaces 3 buildings, or if it's a single building that replaces 2, or if it's a building that replaces 1. And that's what we're in the process of exploring with the community and with the school board. We're accepting feedback on that as well. We have thoughts or concerns about that. We talked a little bit about what the educational aspirations are, so that's one of the next things that happens as we start to understand what if we're designing a project for pre-K, what the district goals are for just that age group, or if it's a pre-K 6, what the district goals are for that age group. And then I did want to take you through what the site selection process looks like, because I think that's the next big hurdle and the next question that's probably on everyone's mind is where might this project be? And I think it's important to understand that it's not the district doesn't have a secret site in mind that they're looking at. It really is going to be a very sort of data-driven exploration to figure out what is the right site for a project. And in order to kind of explain that, I wanted to take you through an example that we just did up at RSU 39. It's been, 5 years since we did this, but that's a great example because they really did have a very rubric-based process that they went through to identify what the right site was for them. So they determined through their visioning process that they would close 3 buildings and create a single pre-K-8 building. So they did a pre-K-8 school. And once they knew that, they identified 6 potential sites in the Caribou area that could accommodate a facility of that size. And it's hard to see, but these little red shapes are those 6 sites. Then they came up with a rating criteria list, and on that list were things that the state requires, like utilities and size of the parcel and buildable area. But it also included things that were important to them, like proximity to existing residential neighborhoods and existing sidewalks. And what were some of the other things? Bus route compatibility. So we look at what the existing bus routes are and what the duration of time that kids would be on a bus would be for each of these sites. And they scored each of the sites for each of those criteria.
And they weighted it.
And they weighted
So out of 28 criteria, you can see some of these in bold: proximity to community facilities. They said, and this was part of their ed specs and their visioning, that we want to have the new school near other complementary services. So when the students get through school, they can go over to the wellness center, or they can go over to the recreation center, and it was right close by. So they put a higher weight on that criteria when they evaluated all the sites.
So then, for each of the 6 sites, they scored them, and they came up with sort of top contenders, 3 top contenders from those 6 sites. And then, once we had the top contenders, we went through with their building committee and their community members what the pros and cons were for each of those sites. So, for the Teague Park site, they were going to be able to demolish 3 empty, unused buildings right in their downtown area, which was something that they really wanted to, address unused buildings in their downtown. But for cons, it was, they had to actually relocate an existing recreational park. They would have to move that because it was going to be on that site. For the Hilltop site, it was in a residential area, so that was a pro. But for cons, it didn't have great water pressure, and it was not in the center of town, which was something that was important to them.
The streets are too narrow, the corners were too tight, and I think it was hard to find. And it wasn't near community services that were real central to their business district.
So they go through that, and they looked at the acreage, they looked at what the wetland impact might be for those sites, they looked at a bunch of different things for those 3 sites. And then we also did test fits on each of the sites. What would a building look like on that site? What would the access be? And what would the circulation look like? Does it fit even? Is the shape of the site conducive to having a building with all this circulation and parking on it? We looked at things like setback requirements. There's an existing brook along this parcel, so we had some required setbacks associated with that. So for each of the sites, we did these little layouts that showed how a building plus play fields plus parking plus access could actually work. And ultimately, they determined that the Teague Park site was the best fit for them. And that was in part because there was existing sidewalks, it was downtown, but as Al mentioned, one of their biggest contributing factors for them was its proximity to existing services for their kids. So that was something, so that's how that process went for them. A similar process would happen here. There would be a data-driven process that we would go through. And, when they came up with that criteria list, we go off and we gather all the data about those criteria to present to them. So we look for all the information that we can find about the utilities for each of the sites, the parcel size, the developable area. We look at what the bus routes would be for each site. We look at what the bus routes would look like and what the duration would be. We look at, we just do all of these different, we do a ton of research.
Phasing.
Construction phasing, right?
Where are the kids? Where are they going to school while all this is happening? So that's also a big one. And we often see ourselves with projects like this as doing a shell game, do the new project, move in. If this building that is being decommissioned, then that might come down or that might get repurposed.
So that's a little bit about the site selection process. That's another of the big pieces that kind of shapes the process of the project. So let's pause again for any questions or feedback or concerns or anything you guys would like to talk about that we haven't addressed yet. Such a quiet bunch. Yes?
I mean, I don't have a question because you addressed it. I had a question the first time around about if we were going to get the survey results, and you went directly into that. So, I mean, thank you very much for your presentation. It obviously shows that you're all in on the whole thing anyway, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think that it's really important. You know, the thing that we talked about with the building committee was it's really important for you. It's so good to see so many of you here to understand what the process looks like and to know that there are lots of little steps and that we don't, that it's not all predetermined, right? So I think that that's, and there's lots of information that will be provided to help you understand the decisions that are being made and help you participate and give feedback on the decisions before they're made. So things like tax information will be part of the information that you get moving forward. I think one of the things that has come up in previous meetings that hasn't come up yet this evening is this idea that it's a state-funded project. What does that mean? Al mentioned that they fund the whole, the kit and caboodle, right? But you also know that, or may have heard that not all schools are 100% funded by the state. And usually what happens, when I say that, what happens is the state will fund the project according to their guidelines. But if the local jurisdiction wants bigger art classrooms, or they want an extra gymnasium in the building, those kinds of square footage additions that go above and beyond what the guidelines are allowable by the Department of Education, those would be locally funded. So there would be a second bond measure that would be local only, so that would not be subsidized by the state. And those are for things that are what the state considers premiums, which sometimes seems like a ridiculous term when it means 200 more square feet for your art classrooms. But it's what they consider in order to create parity across the state for the buildings that they develop. It's what they consider above and beyond their design criteria. So some local districts will decide that, that having a larger gymnasium is really important to them. And so that additional square footage would be something that the local bond would pick up. Or, for example, in the past, what we've done is we've increased the infrastructure in the building so that photovoltaic panels could be added to the roofs at a later date. So increasing the strength of the roof's structural system, that's something that historically the state has not paid for. So that's like maybe it's a $40,000 increase in steel tonnage for the building, just so that you could have a power purchase agreement in the future for PVs on the roof. So, or added insulation. The state will pay for code mandated insulation in your envelope, but maybe you want to increase that a little bit and improve your envelope efficiency and your energy efficiency. So those kinds of things, those additional things, are things that the state wouldn't fund, but those are all on top of a building that meets code and provides, good
Ventilation, sprinkler system.
ventilation, sprinkler system, all the things that you need. Yeah.
Technology.
That's right. So, anything else anybody wants to talk about tonight? Concerns? Worries?
There will be plenty of time to give us comment and feedback. The website, the forums, there will be straw polls along the way. There's actually, once there's a vision for a project, there's always subcommittees, furnishings and colors, and that make recommendations to the building committee. So there's plenty of places to get involved in the project. I think it's an exciting time. What we don't want to do is get to referendum and somebody says, I didn't know about the project. There's a project. So that's all the strategic work, the really important work happens between now and referendum. And all the critical thinking, the program, the number of classrooms, the configuration, it all happens now.
What are your, oh, yes, go ahead.
Just one question. Back to where you said Clinton and Albion and how much they were going to cost, 10 years. Is this project 10 years down the line?
No. So that's a great question. So we anticipate, based on what typically happens in the DOE process, we anticipate that this project will likely go to referendum in June of next year. Once it goes to referendum in June of next year, then it takes about a year for us to put together contract documents to put out to bid. And then it takes about 2 plus or minus years to build it. So all in, we're probably 4 to 5 years out from opening a project. And that assumes that everything kind of goes along the traditional path at the traditional rate. There could be things that slow it down or speed it up or whatever. But so no, it's not that far out. Thank you for asking that, because I can see how that would be confusing. What are your thoughts? Oh, yes, go ahead.
Is the district looking at just to replace not only the primary school, but the other 3 schools also? Combining all the kids into one school. Earlier you mentioned in order to do that with the population of the students, it would take so many acres to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Does the district have in mind where they're going to do it at?
The district doesn't, no, we don't have a site in mind. There's no site in mind. That's something that we have to go out and seek out. If you know someone who's interested in selling some property, let Roberta know. But honestly, we have to go find the parcel of land. And that's what the site selection process I was talking about. We hopefully will be able to identify a couple of different locations that we can look at all of the criteria for and find the best one. In terms of what the district is looking at for consolidation, they're currently, up to now, we've been exploring all of the possibilities, potentially replacing just Fairfield, or replacing Fairfield, Clinton, and Albion, potentially looking at Benton, which has some life left in it, and reloading that so that the spaces are used more appropriately. Right now, a lot of the special ed for the district happens at Benton, but the spaces aren't necessarily best suited for that. So the district is actually looking at and exploring a number of different options there. But they are keeping in mind the fact that the cost of ownership of those existing buildings is high. And that's something that is factoring into the decisions that we're making. What are your thoughts?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking, okay, the primary school, everything started out with the primary school for the age of it and the condition, which is a little under 49,000 square feet. Out of that 49,000 square feet, how many square feet is actually used for the kids?
That's a good question, but Alan has that information.
I do have that.
Yeah.
It's not all of it. It's
Well, no, I can understand that, because you mentioned earlier with the 7 levels. I went to school there too, and I can't remember how many levels it was, but,
it's right.
So you asked me about Fairfield. I have gross square feet of close to 49,000 square feet. and I have net usable at 44,000 square feet.
Wow, okay,
And that's pretty darn good
yeah.
in terms of net to gross.
And that's largely because it's such a compact footprint, right? All this is up and down.
Right, yeah.
It's not necessarily good for them.
Right, right.
And that's only pre-K and kindergarten.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And childcare, that's right.
Oh, yeah, childcare, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
That's about 117 students, I think, roughly.
Yeah, yeah. And also, you mentioned earlier, with some of these other districts, building their schools and stuff, you want it to stay within the combines of the town, the activities within the town,
That particular district.
you know, yes. And it seems to me like there's not really any room in town of Fairfield. It doesn't seem like Benton has much room to expand there unless they buy some of the farmland. Of course, Clinton and Albion has nothing either. To keep things locally for the kids, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of options for us.
Yeah, I think we haven't gotten to that step yet of looking for sites, but if that concern has come up in previous meetings. So it's probably something we'll want to get going on and put out a call for parcels that the people might be interested in selling, so that we can start looking at what the options are. Yeah. We did look a little bit at there's some land down behind the high school there. We did look at that. It's on the small side, but we did look at that as a possibility because that's owned by the district already. But yeah, it's something to note that Al mentioned earlier is that the purchase of land for the project is also part of the project. So that is something that the state funds as well as purchase of the property. Good. Oh, I'm sorry.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is this just for the elementary schools, or is the entire school, the junior high and high school included in this project?
Yeah, so at this time, it's just the elementary schools. And that's in part, that was the thinking behind the applications that went into the Department of Education back in 2017, was just replacement of the 3 primary elementary schools, Clinton, Albion, and Fairfield. So right now, the junior high school and the high school are not part of this exploration. Yes?
But how are we looking at redistributing our population? Because we already redistricted the fact that 6th graders attend our elementary schools.
Right, so, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, right now, the board has asked us to look at it holistically as a pre-K-6 population, with the anticipation that potentially pre-K could be universal if that becomes part of the project, and it could be an offering for pre-K. So the board has not talked to us yet about the possibility of reloading that sixth grade age group. So right now, it's like we're looking at a pre-K-6 population. Yes?
Well, 2 things. One is that thinking as a townsperson who is ultimately kind of a secondary parent to the children, theoretically, I understand that the state takes care of the capital situation, but nevertheless, the town raises the children, or at least that really is what happens. If we're putting the children first, then they really come before even a major project such as this. So, as I see it, if there isn't an obvious, and it doesn't seem to be, at least within the given parameters right now, that there is an obvious building situation, then, there seems like compromises start having to be made. Because when these buildings were built, you had existing, almost the same demographics of where people live, and they built them for the children with only the children in mind. So they might be antiquated, and clearly they're inefficient, and they also don't meet ADA compliance, but they're not necessarily wrongfully placed or populated. So there's that. There's that. And I guess if I would push to it, I would say, well, what's best for the children is what's best for the children, irrespective of. And it does make me think about, just because I'm familiar with those areas, you know, there's been growth going on in Guilford and Cambridge and Ripley and whatnot, and now that's going to multiply. You know, so those kids are going to be playing sports with these kids. They live in the same state. It's really, especially Central Maine, tends to be kind of like a little island. So I don't see how we necessarily lose, but taking that too far. The other thing that I wanted to also mention is that in Fairfield, and I don't know, I get a sense, I didn't grow up in Fairfield, but I get a sense that this really is more of a Fairfield thing than in other places, is that I don't know how many people are here from the school, but I'll say at least half of the people are probably connected to the school, I'm guessing. And there's not many people here. Fairfield and the school do not enjoy a great cohabitative community relationship. They don't exactly sit under the same roof. That's not to say that they don't get along and they don't work together. Public Works will do plowing for the school, vice versa, it's fine. They're amenable to building back there, which I think is like a waste of whatever, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be filled, couldn't be brought in. But nevertheless, in terms of what exposure the state gets, State Department of Education gets, I think you're really going to get a community view is really going to be the school community, not necessarily the town. And it is the town who has to provide the bus drivers who have been in short supply. This was brought up in one of your previous meetings. That's not just a short-term problem. The fuel, which only a few years ago, most of the towns, including this town, had to suspend their sports programs because they couldn't even fuel their buses. Yes, we've had fracking and things looking great right now, but to project from that, I'm sure the state knows this, to project from that 20, 30 years down the road, just based on the last 3 years, it's not good for the town anyway. Or might not be. So there's that. So I don't think that the town, necessarily is going to step forward and say this. And I think that everybody in the town would agree with the first point that I made, which is that what's best for the students is what's best for the students. But I don't think that they're necessarily going to completely step up. And it's unfortunate they don't, because you're making it as available to them as possible. But I just wanted to bring that, that kind of perspective into the whole thing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good perspective. Yeah. Yes.
Can I just address, I think that the school board in the town of Fairfield that's something that we are trying to do, is mend that relationship. But I think because the district encompasses 4 towns, I believe that relationship needs to happen with all 4 towns, not just with Fairfield. So, anyway.
I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, I mean, when we seek out input from the community, we mean the taxpayers, right? And that includes people who don't teach in the buildings, who don't have kids in the buildings. But generally speaking, when it's not uncommon when we do these types of projects, the people who participate in these kinds of forums are the ones who are directly involved with schools because they have kids there, because they teach there or whatever. So it is difficult for us to outreach beyond just the school community. But I think that it's nice to, I know that there are other people here beyond just that and have been at other meetings as well. So, but we really encourage that. Right? We want to hear from the taxpayer population because it is their budget. Any other comments or concerns? Yes.
I have 2 things just kind of mulling around in my head about what you had said before regarding the schools, their placements, and the lot decision. So when you had gone through the example, and they had narrowed it down to 3 lots, then you kind of placed a building on the lot. And I kind of thought, well, how do they know that the building is going to look like that?
It's a pretend building.
So I'm thinking, like, has there been an instance where you've gone through this process and you've identified lots, or the lots haven't, like, matched the vision? So say we decide as a district we want to, for cost reasons, make a unified school, elementary, pre-K, for 3-year-olds up to 6. That's our vision. so that has to come before we decide what the building's gonna look like, its
That's right.
shape, its whatever,
That's
and
right.
before we decide how big this.
That's right.
So now, okay, we've got this vision, and we go out and we don't have, like you said, we don't have set lot that meets requirements that someone's willing to sell us. At that point, do you go back and like have to rethink, like, what does that look like? Have you had that experience before in this process?
I don't know that we've ever had the experience where we couldn't find a site.
Okay, that's comforting.
But I will say, I don't know if you noticed, but in those test fits, the shape of the building was different on each site. It's basically just, what we do is we know that the state will support X number of square feet per student. So once we know how many students are there, we kind of know what the building blocks will be. So
Okay.
they're just sort of squares on a plan.
Okay.
But they don't necessarily, at the end of the day, the building that was built didn't look like any of those
Mm-hmm.
that we showed on the site. But we just sort of think about potentially what a block of the right size would look, how that could fit on the site. Yeah, exactly.
We make lots of assumptions. But we do that with you, and then test them, okay?
Okay.
So a lot of these diagrams, when we started to test them, we kind of whittle it down. Okay, we got process of elimination, and then it could be, okay, what is the program? How big, all right, is it 1 floor, 2 floors, 3 floors, or 13 levels?
Yeah.
Hopefully we're not at that point, but what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
there's a real give and take, and a back and forth, and we'll massage it, and we'll find the right fit.
So then, the second piece to that was once you said that, and they went with this idea, this particular district went all the way up to 8, that means they closed 3 schools.
Yes.
And it made me think about the conversations this district has had over the last couple of years about closing schools.
Mm-hmm.
And how near and dear, as you clearly showed us with all the renovations we've done,
Mm-hmm.
to keep these schools as functioning as possible, that they are near and dear buildings to our hearts. So then my mind is like, okay, so say we move forward with this, and we say, yeah, we want to close schools, what happens to those schools? And maybe this is a remote question, but like,
Yeah, that's a great question.
what happens to those?
Yeah.
Are they still a financial burden to the district?
So-
Are they then like, someone please come by us?
I think what typically happens, and I don't know exactly what the process will be here, but what typically happens is those buildings can be returned to the town to take on another life as a community center or as something else. So they are usually divested from the district if they're not going to be used as schools anymore. And typically they're divested back to the town in which they reside. And then the town owns them to repurpose them for something else. Maybe they move their town hall there or whatever. But typically they are divested back to the towns. If the district doesn't have use for it, I will say that we have had instances where a school is then turned into the district office. Right, it takes on another life within the district. But typically they're divested back to the towns. Roberta, did you want to comment?
No, I think that's a terrific answer, but yes, it is a position of them, and there are instances where sometimes the communities don't accept the response.
That's where my heart is going, like, oh, this is gonna be another one of, like you just mentioned, like, another turmoil between the towns and the districts, and,
Well,
you know.
one of the, because there's a lot of talk when these projects are laid out, of gymnasiums, and they, these facilities are the heart of these communities, and the use of those gymnasiums, this one in particular, high use, but, so the town keeps the gym open and has some other peripheral program, I don't know, just a possibility.
Do you ever demolish and build on the site where the school currently exists?
Yes.
That happens all the time.
I mean, if I could come back to your question, you were saying, what happens to our little schools going forward, okay? In the communities, we're so comfortable with these. If we do a consultant, what happens with that school over here? And I think that's a question for every community that's being driven by different And it was huge the amount of money that they were spending to carry these buildings forward. So there was a lot of pressure there to save tax dollars and do something that was more efficient. And so that was a big component. It wasn't the only component, but it was just one part of the story that had to be told.
I guess I just think too, like, as we move forward in this process, it's going to be really important for us to keep that in mind, that if we are going to do that, kind of making sure as a board, as a group that's trying to design these buildings or get that referendum, because we want people to believe in us and what's happening, that piece doesn't get left out, that, you know, we have an idea of what's going to happen to that, or at least that there's some communication to the public, because I think that we are very passionate about the heritage, and people have grown up and lived and had their grandchildren go to these schools. So when you were talking earlier about like what our values are, I think that might be a vital piece to the project.
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me about this community that I have never seen in another community that I absolutely love is that you're all bulldogs. I love that. That there's no, you know, it's not like this school is the pandas and this school is the unicorns. It's so it's clear that that community, that long-standing passion is there. And I think that that's something that definitely needs to carry forward. So we agree. You had another.
I was only going to kind of half joke that if there was a property that this was going to be defaulted back to the town, let's say the town didn't want it, that speaking as a person who's normally very involved with the town side of things, we would, and if a pool could be created in one of those locations, it would happen. That being said, you know, just something to stick back in the back of your mind anyway. Because in Warville, Colby just opened the largest pool in all of New England. That doesn't include the Y, which is also a fantastically progressive, thanks to the Alphons and various cultural situations in Warville. This area has been lacking. The only pool I know is the Peak Habitat, whatever it is, rehabilitative pool up in there's a next to a hospital up there. So you know, that's something that could be a great gift.
They won't fund the pool.
No, I know.
That's their guidelines.
Yeah, I know. You know, doesn't hurt.
I'm putting that down on the list.
You said there's 5,000 square feet available still in Fairfield Park.
Yes.
Just a little bit of clarification on my part is the Benton School goes from first grade up to sixth grade.
Correct.
And that's for the whole district, Clinton, Albion.
So Clinton and Albion are kindergarten through 6.
Through 6?
Yes. Pre-K. Oh, I'm sorry. Pre-K, excuse me. Pre-K
Okay,
through
yeah.
6. Clinton and Albion are pre-K through 6. Fairfield currently is just daycare, pre-K, and kindergarten, and Benton is 1st through 6th. And then the junior high school is 7, 8, high school 11, 12.
Yeah. So are we looking at constructing a school for daycare, pre-K, kindergarten, all the way up to 6th grade? Or just up until the 1st grade, then they go to Benton?
So that's part of what we need to work through with the building committee and the board is if a new school, let's say hypothetically, a new building is built that could take some of the population and Benton is reloaded to take some of the population. So potentially a new building could be pre-K through 4 and then 5 and 6 happen at Benton. That could be one permutation of the exploration process. So we don't know the answer to that question yet, but that's something that we're looking at is what is the capacity of Benton to potentially be reloaded with a different grade level, and what would a new facility house?
Our student population is declining year after year.
Right, so we're looking at...
And is Benton overcrowded as it stands now?
Benton is maxed out in large part because it also houses a lot of the special ed for the district. So right now, Benton has the smallest classroom size, physically classroom size, but the highest classroom population. So whereas I think at Albion, correct me if I'm wrong, you're about 7 students per teacher at Albion. At Benton, you're about 20 to 22 students per teacher. So it is, we would say, and the state would say, for the size of the classrooms, those classrooms are overloaded. But if the building has a large amount of the services that the district offers there as well. So that would be looked at as well, because if there's a new facility that could house or take care of some of the special education spaces in a more appropriate space distribution, then maybe those would get moved from Benton to a new facility, and the spaces that are currently used for special ed at Benton could be reallocated for other programmatic things like classroom sizes.
Is there any room in Benton to add on another pod?
So that's one of the things that we looked at, and one of the challenges with Benton is that the construction type of Benton would require some code upgrades in order to add on to it, to make it a larger building. It's sort of maxed out at the current size that it is because of the construction type. Also, the existing pods have hip rooms, they have multiple rooms, so adding on to those is challenging. But also, it's a smaller site, so out behind Benton is the play fields, and we'd basically be encroaching onto those play fields in order to add on, unless additional property was added to Benton. If additional property was added to Benton, then there's a potential for expansion that would make sense. But the building itself, physically the building is tricky to add on to. It's not impossible, but it's tricky.
Yeah, the other thing that we look at is core programs, like the learning commons, the dining commons, special education. So as the population gets bigger and you say, oh, I just want to have another 8 or 9 classrooms, that also affects those core areas in order to stay within the guidelines of program distribution, if you will, and how many meals you can run in one day. So that's another thing that we have to be careful of when we look at what your existing buildings can do.
Also, if I can just add, that is a great example in regard to programming changes, because the school district several years back moved to consolidate some programming and centralize it in Benton and move those programs out of Clinton Elementary and Allen Elementary. But with that comes a need for real estate, spaces, annexing a pod or a program. And also, because part of the selection team was to visit some construction projects and looking at, say for example, the restroom in this lobby area here. Schools going up now have single-use restrooms. They are not building stalls anymore. That takes a lot of space when we're thinking about how big the building needs to be. Kathy and Alan had on the slide, are we supportive of universal pre-K? We have pre-K in our school district, but it's not universal, meaning we contract with Katie Cat. They staff it to a max, in Clinton, and we have a section of that. That's all we offer. It's filled, and then that's it. Or are we looking at the possibility of serving, a full population potentially, just like in kindergarten? Whoever shows up to register, we accommodate them. If we have another section, we do. So that is a program that we don't have right now. If we expand it, it's going to take a dedicated space for that. And those spaces look like now to accommodate little people, or you think you walk into that primary building, it was, high school, and it served all kinds of uses, but there were little tiny people in there, navigating around, and not build such a facility for little people. So there are lots of things that have evolved, and our district has moved for cost savings, to try to solve some of that problem and some of the drivers. And it comes down to, what our community can afford. The state subsidizes our operation, staffing, running the buildings at a certain level, but the locals bear the difference, including smaller section sizes in schools. These are all older facilities repair, in my view, it was inoperable. And we had no resource for that. We don't have, 5 years out capital improvement, these are old buildings, older buildings. And, just the cost, we talk about the cost of ownership and maintaining them, but it's like, what if something else happens that's more significant and catastrophic, and what means do we have to repair it and restore it, So those are pieces to consider, and as you mentioned, we're looking at submitting another application for this next round of federal monies to retrofit and upgrade our ventilation systems. So we had Siemens come in and look at the junior senior high complex, look at Benton, but there is nothing to upgrade the other schools. We're going to put in air purifiers and replace windows, but just the quality of the health environment. So these are, I'm not trying to sell anything in particular, but all the things that we must consider as factors to a decision, and we have this opportunity, just like that ESSER money. It's an opportunity to correct something that we don't have budgeted for, replace windows or upgrading systems. This is an opportunity to find some efficiencies, but also, as George said, it comes right down to programming that serves the children, and what is that the best experience we can provide. And it's not about the facility, it's about what the people who work in it, and the children who are here can do it. We think about robotics, where is that equipment? It's hauled out, it's stuck somewhere, and that's our newer building. I think about those programs here, they're in, in cubby space versus those maker spaces or places where kids look around and not, sticking things in closets and teachers scooping around and trying to pull it all together. It's there, dedicated for that kind of learning, hands-on work. So those are all the things that we need to think about, look at, and become aware of what's out there. Back to when our selection committee visited these sites. I've worked here for the better part of my career in these spaces, but what's out there? What are other children able to experience just due to some resources that the community has and doesn't? So anyway, there's lots to think about. It's exciting. We're taking steps now.
I just was wondering, when you're talking about this, and you're talking about pre-K, universal pre-K, the program, those kinds of things, what about the fact that Fairfield Primary serves that 3-year-old and 4-year-old program that isn't, like, the DOE is not going to consider, like, spaces for childcare?
Yes.
Yes, they will, or
Yes,
they will
If
consider?
we determine that this is something that we want and support, and it is in place
Right.
to the degree that we are capable of providing it right now.
Well, I mean, that was the huge crisis that we had this year, was there was no space for childcare to function to support the community with our current situation of having a community schedule. So I was just wondering if that's in a conversation, are we at risk of losing that?
No, it's just, the idea that it's universal, that it's expanded. We are not at that right now. And is it something that we, again, we contract Title I with Katie County to provide most of that to us in our families, but it's limited. It's capped.
Right, for pre-K, but not for the
No,
3-year-old.
for pre-K.
Right, but for the 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds that are in childcare.
Yes.
That would be
They
something
are
that-
building projects that address the birth of 5. And school districts are looking at that. So if we determine locally that this community supports that and wants it, we can build something to accommodate those sorts of needs.
I wanted to come back to your question a little bit, in terms of square footage, not to gross, and not really getting in the weeds too much, but just to talk about efficiency, okay? When you look at the buildings in their entirety, the Department of Education has us look at, how many square feet per student? is it requiring for that school over there, and that school over there, and that school over there? And there's quite a range, as you can imagine. You have a school for 100 students, and you have a gymnasium, and you have a kitchen, and you have a cafeteria. That's a lot of square footage to support by just a few students. So if we look at Fairfield, we're at 270 square feet per student. Albion is at 212, Benton is 159, and Clinton is at 137. So it's quite a range between, basically the gross square foot per student. In our work with the Department of Education, there is a sweet spot for schools where you get some really incredible efficiencies. And it's closer to the size of Denton. Because then you can distribute more of the program amongst more students and be using those spaces more. 80% is what we look at for utilization. When you look at the overall program, that means at any one time during the day, you're using all those spaces. They're not sitting empty. So that's that's just a rubric. That's just one way of looking at the schools.
Before we go tonight, I did want to point out the location on the website where you can provide more feedback and get more information. So on the MSAD 49 website, which is msad49.org, there is a link here for an online survey, SurveyMonkey, that you can fill out. There's also an email address here, questions@msad49.org, that you can send your questions to, you can send your comments, send your poetry, whatever you need to send to us. And then down at the bottom, there's a link, this button here for school construction project. If you click there, that's where the district is posting all of the information that we have so far. So all of these forums have been videotaped. All of those have been uploaded to the website. The slideshow that we've given tonight will be up there. There's other information there. There's the 21-step process that I showed you. That's linked onto the website. So there's lots of information available, and we'll just keep adding to it as we go. So one of the things that we're developing is a frequently asked questions sheet with all the questions that have been asked in these past forums. We're trying to get answers to some of the ones that we don't know the answers to, and then make sure that we've posted answers to all of the questions that we've asked so far. So that's a great resource to stay abreast of the process of the project, and also to send your questions and the survey. I suspect that over time that we might continue to have a survey, but the survey might change. So we'll make sure that that's clearly identifiable, so you have to take the same survey more than once. But we did get one of the things that we did at the beginning, the 2 forums that we did back in January, was we asked the population, we asked the people who were at those meetings, and we asked in the survey itself how people would like to submit their feedback, and surveys was the number one answer. Surveys. So that was something that we'll probably continue to do. People seem to like to fill out surveys, so we'll keep asking you to fill out surveys. That's how we'll get information from the community, which is good. So, thank you all so much for